Dear viewers, this is the first of the promised lectures on the genus Entoloma, in which I give you an introduction into the genus and give you an impression about the diversity you find in this genus. And I also tell something about the places where you can find and collect them. I have given this lecture the motto, no need to be afraid. And that refers to the fact that many people think that Entolomas are quite difficult. And indeed, they are difficult in a way that you often need a lot of information before you are able to use the keys. And this information is, for example, not only how the fruit bodies look like, but also where are they found, to what trees they are possibly connected, and very important, of course, the microscopy. But first I will introduce the genus as it is situated within a family Entolomataceae. This family, which is a sister to the Phylogeny, is characterized by having a pink or pinkish brown spore print, and the spores have an internal skeleton that causes that's the reason why they look not smooth when you see them under a microscope, or better still, under a scanning microscope. You see that they are having a sort of three-dimensional shape. In the genus Rhodosobi, or the complex of Rhodosobi, because nowadays this group is split up in several small genera, you have a spore type that is more or less bumpy or warty. And you can see on this scanning electron microscope that the surface is uneven with a sort of bumps. And you can also see that there are ridges that are not always completely connected. That's typical for the group Rhodosobi, and it is considered the most primitive spore shape that we find in the family Entolomataceae. The second group is the genus Clytopolis, a small genus, not so many species. Fruit bodies are mostly looking like an Omphalina or a Crepidotris-like, with a reduced stipe. And the spores have a very peculiar configuration. They have longitudinal ribs. The ribs run from top to the bottom of the spores. And when you look on top of the spores in a microscopic preparation, you can see that the outline is more or less angular. And then finally, we have the genus Entoloma, which is by far the largest genus in the whole family. And they have spores that are angular when seen from the side, but also when seen from the top. And they are made of a system of ribs that connect with each other and forming this typical angular spore shape that is seen in Entoloma. Now, I have only shown the most common fruit body types within the family. That's mushroom-like with a cap, gills, and a stem. But in this family, you also find truffle-like fruit body types that grow either semi-submerged or entirely under the ground. They are shaped like a truffle. You also see when you cut them through that they don't have gills, but they have a sort of labyrinth-like structure on which the spores are produced. And in the inset, you see the spores of this particular truffle-like structure, and they are very, very similar to the normal Entoloma type spores. So this genus, which comprises about a couple of species, mostly in the southern hemisphere, is transferred to the genus Entoloma recently on account of a very thorough molecular study, a phylogenetic study. So that's in great lines how the family Entolomataceae is structured. Now we come to the subject of this talk. What is an Entoloma? Well, you've already seen the spore print of an Entoloma is pink, That's also seen on the gills when they are mature. And also very often you find the spores on top of the cap, like here in this example, they fell down from the other fruit bodies on the cap underneath, or you find them dusted on the stipe. So that is a very easy way to recognize an Entoloma in the field. The spores are angular, as I've already told, and this spore shape can vary a great deal. So you have small, more or less isodiametrical spores that are hardly angled. You have heterodiametrical spores with blunt or sharp angles. You have star-shaped spores in number 4. You have cuboid-shaped spores that are almost like a cubus, a cube. And in some cases, you'll find spores that are almost nodules. And these spore shape types are very important in recognizing groups and species. Some more facts. Entolomas occur all over the world. And the interesting thing is they occur in almost all kinds of habitats. You find them on sea level, you find them in the plains, you find them in the steppe areas, in forests. You find them on the high mountains, even on the top, and also in the Arctic. You can find in the Arctic tundra quite a few Entoloma species. So obviously it is a very successful genus in a way that they were able to colonize all kinds of habitat types. And maybe as a consequence of this very versatile way they can explore habitats, there are many and many species. I have made a sort of calculation. I think there are probably more than 4,000 species worldwide. That makes Entoloma one of the largest genera in Agarix, and maybe only Cortinarius is larger. In Europe, the estimate is that we come to 500, maybe 600 species. We find new species every day, generally speaking, not every day, but there's many species that still can be discovered, especially in habitats that are yet unexplored. And so I expect that when the new monograph in Fungi Europaea is ready, we'll have about 550 species. As I said, the genus is very diverse, and that translates itself also in fruit body shape, fruit body habitus. You have species that are more or less like a tricoloma. You have Mycena-like fruit bodies, some that resemble Colibria or Omphalina, and even reduced fruit body types that resemble Crepiodotus, not to speak of the truffle-like ones. And the question arises, are they really belonging all to one and the same genus? And that has been a discussion that goes on already for maybe 1.5 centuries. And there's two distinct opinions. One tells you that Entoloma is a very large genus that comprises all taxa with angular spores. That is the way I look at it. But there are also quite some people, particularly in the English-speaking world, in England and Americas, that say, no, you can divide Entoloma in several distinct, separate genera. A whole different approach is taken by Professor Horak, formerly from Zurich, now in Innsbruck, in Austria, who is a world expert in the genus Entoloma. He wrote quite a few books and papers on the subject. He divides the genus in 3 genera. One genus for the reduced fruit body types, the Crepidotis-like fruit body types that he calls Cloudopus. He puts the species with a mycenoid habit and long hairs on cap and stipe in the genus Posarella, and all other Entolomas are in the genus Entoloma. This is, from a practical point of view, is easy to recognize these 3 genera, but it's very apparent that these genera are not natural. So the debate goes on, and we don't know yet how the discussion will end. There has been quite some research with molecular methods to produce a phylogeny of the whole group, but we have not yet succeeded in having a completely resolved phylogeny. And that's mainly due to the fact that because it is a species-rich and diverse genus, it's very hard to get complete sampling. And we cannot build such a phylogeny, such a system, just only on the European and North American species. You need to involve also all those species that occur in the tropics of the New and Old World, and that has not yet been done. So it's quite interesting to see what future brings in this respect. Here a slide that shows this diversity of Entoloma. As you can see from left to right, we have Entolomas that resemble a tricoloma. You have the ones that resemble Colibia, Omphalina. They are reduced Crepidotus-like or Mycena-like. And these habit types are the main criterion on which the classical divisions within the genus are based. Here are a few examples of Entolomas that resemble a Mycena. To the left, you have the group that's called Nolania. Some people call it subgenus Nolania. They have these conical caps that expand with age. They are usually fairly smooth, glabrous, and for the great part hygrophanous. That means that they change color when dried out. The genus Posarella or subgenus Posarella has a similar Mycena-like habit, but they have interesting thick-walled and encrusted hairs on cap and style. This group is very distinct, not only in morphology, but also in the phylogenies. They always come very distant and separate. Then there's a group that's called Leptonia in the strict sense. They have also this mycenoid and sometimes a little bit tricolomatoid habit with a scaly cap. And that's the three main groups with the Mycena-like fruit body type. Then we have a group that is resembling a tricoloma, and a very big group is formed by what we call the rhodopolioid Entoloma types. Entoloma rhodopolium is the very distinct species growing mainly in forest with this tricoloma-like habit. And interestingly, this group is the only group, most probably, within the whole genus Entoloma that forms mycorrhiza with trees. All other Entolomas are supposed to be saprotrophs growing on dead organic material, but the last word is not said yet about these things, because particularly in the case of grassland inhabiting Entolomas, there might be some other sort of symbiosis with higher plants, but that's still a matter that has not completely solved this question, which is in fact, of course, very interesting. Within these groups of tricoloma-like Entolomas, you have the ones with a more or less smooth cap. That's the so-called Rhodopolia group, to which this spring Entoloma, Entoloma clipeatum, belongs. And the other group, which is much smaller, only maybe 20-25 species at all, that's called Trichopilus. That means hairy cap, and the Trichopilus species here is Entoloma porphyrophaeum. That's an iconic species with beautiful porphyry purple color that grows in special type of grasslands. They have a cap that's not smooth, but having these fine radially oriented fibrils that sometimes forms very small squamules. Then there's quite a few Entolomas that more or less resemble Colibia, with a more or less flattened cap that's often a little bit depressed at the center, with a young and enrolled cap margin with adnate emarginate gills. And two examples are given here: Entoloma cerulatum, belonging to the subgenus Cyanula, and Entoloma melanosmum, that's one of the species around Entoloma nidorosum in the Rhodopodia group. So in the Rhodopodia group, you find both Trigoloma-like fruit body types and colibioid fruit body types. Quite a few Entolomas resemble very much species of Omphalina with decurrent gills that are often arcuate and going down the stipe quite distinctly. They usually have a depressed to funnel-shaped cap. And here two examples, Entoloma incarnato fuscescens and Entoloma undatum. And in the last species, you see this very nice structured cap surface consisting of fine hairs that have air in between them, so they reflect the light and therefore sometimes give a sort of zonated impression. And then the last form group within Entoloma, that's the species that resemble a small Crapidotus or Pleurotus. And to the left, one of the distinct ones, that's Entoloma piscisadum, a species that grows on wood. And what's very interesting in this particular group is also that they often show a very distinct layer of hyphae that is growing over the substrate. A very interesting and funny species I find is this Entoloma parasiticum, which is known to grow as a parasite on various mushrooms, in this case on a chanterelle-like fruit body, but they can also be found on all kinds of corticiaceous fungi. And they form very small Crapidotus-like fruit bodies. The next subject of my talk, that's about habitats. Where do Entoloma grow? Where have you a big chance to find these species? And I will show you a couple of habitat types, not all, that's not possible within the concept of a relatively small talk. But one of the interesting and rich habitats for Entolomas is formed by what we call semi-natural grasslands. That can be grasslands that are managed for a long time in the same way. For example, grasslands where you have cattle grazing, and particularly those grasslands that have been treated in the same way for many, many years, even centuries, they appear to be very rich in Entolomas. And you find them in Europe in all kinds of places, preferably on the richer soils, on the calcareous soils. Here is an example of a calcareous grassland in the province of Limburg in the Netherlands. And to the right, we have a grassland in Wales, and also the subalpine meadows in the Alps can be very rich in Entolomas. And they form with other mushrooms a very distinct fungal community, comprising not only of Entoloma, but you find a lot of waxcaps, hygroscopies, Claveriaceae, a species like Geoglossum, etc. These communities are very rich in species, many rare species who come there, but they are also threatened because agricultural methods change, farmers stop with farming. So quite a few of these most interesting grasslands slowly change because they're not managed anymore in the same way, and there's all kinds of trees that start growing there. So these habitat types are quite vulnerable and threatened. And there's quite some organizations nowadays that fight for the conservation of this kind of very rich fungal communities. Another habitat that's also great for Entoloma that's found in Europe along the Atlantic coast in the form of dune grasslands. And here you see such an example. This is what we call a gray dune. That's at the inner side of the white sandy, shifting sandy dunes. And they are covered with a vegetation of mosses and grasses mainly, and sometimes with some salix, ribbons mixed in. These habitats are also very rich for all kinds of Entolomas and also box caps and dew blossoms, etc. And one of the examples is Entoloma vindobonense, that's originally been described from grasslands along the Danube near Vienna, but it appears to be quite a distinct species in these gray dunes growing in association with the very common moss totula. Then we have the wet habitats like this sphagnum box, and this harbors a group of specialized Entoloma species, of which I show here two examples, Entoloma elodes, which is belonging to the subgenus Trichopilus with this more or less radially fibrous caps, very distinct species growing in living sphagnum. And another example is Entolomataceae that also prefers these mostly a bit acid PT habitats. It's in the group of the cyanola with colored lamella edge, as you can see here, and very distinct because of the brown translucent cap. Entolomas also go on high mountains and in the Arctic tundra, and here you see me collecting in what you can call a forest of Salix polaris, willow species that is about 1 centimeter high. This vegetation type, this habitat is extremely rich in fungi. Hundreds and hundreds of different species grow there, mainly Cortinarius species, Hebuloma, Inocebi species, but also quite a few Entolomas from those groups that form mycorrhiza. So all these fungi growing here are associated with this Salix polaris, and it's quite exciting to realize that one very small tree, sometimes it's only one stem of 1 centimeter with a few leaves, can have a very rich community of fungi around its roots. And here you saw this Entoloma atrocericium. I've been collecting quite a lot in Scandinavia and Finland, and a particular habitat that's very rich in Entolomas can be found in form of a Picea forest, spruce forest, on rich soil, on calcareous soil that has a very rich undergrowth of herbs. It was called a herb-rich spruce forest, and that can be also extremely rich in Entoloma species. And here you see such an example of the famous Holmvassdalen Nature Reserve in northern Norway, where I think now we have found something like 60 or 70 different Entoloma species, of which quite a few appear to be new to science. And one of them is a recently described species, Entoloma holmvassdalenense, with a beautiful purplish, bluish, blackish cap with very neat, fine squamules. It's a very distinct and interesting species. So these habitats that occur spread over the north are indeed very, very rich. And since they are also threatened, there's quite some areas now protected. The group of Entolomas that grow in association with trees is very large, this Rhodopolia group. There are about 50 species in Europe, I suppose. And one of the habitats that appear to be rich in species is this typical Tilia forest, Linde Tilia, that grows on calcareous bedrock. And recently we describe some new species from this habitat, for example, this Entolomataceae frondose. But also in this habitat you find quite some representatives of the subgenus Cyanoa, like this Entoloma corvinum-like type with a beautiful bluish-black cap and stipe and contrasting white gills. In the Mediterranean, you have widespread vegetation type that's called garrigue or maquis, or there's a lot of local names for that. It's vegetation of small shrubs and grasses. Often there is some grazing around, and in and around these bushes, you'll find also quite some Entoloma species, and some of them associated, mycorrhizal, with cistus roses and helianthemum. That's an interesting kind of ectomycorrhiza. And one of the examples shown here is Entoloma cystophyllum. As the name already tells you, this is a species associated with cistus. And then when we go outside Europe, there is, of course, a lot more to discover. I had the pleasure and the privilege to collect quite a lot in the Tasmania, the southernmost state of Australia, where you have this extensive temperate rainforest composed of notophagus and eucalypts with a dense lower layer of huge tree ferns and mosses, and it's a very, very interesting and beautiful habitat. And together with Genevieve Gates and David Redkowski, I discovered here quite some Entoloma species, of which most were new to science, and they've been published a couple of years ago in a nice book that's called the Entolomataceae of Tasmania, and show two examples of those new species, Entolomataceae on top with the bright yellow gills, and the blue thing that resembles the European species Entoloma bloxamii, but is different, and we named it Entoloma perloxamii. And then a final example in the tropical rainforest. This example comes from Malaysia. And in these rich, diverse habitats, you can find quite some Entolomas, most of them also undescribed. And that's shown here with two still unnamed species that have been collected there a couple of years ago. Of course, it's impossible to be complete. There are many more habitat types that are rich in Entolomas, particularly outside Europe. But I hope I've given you an impression of where you can find the Entoloma species. And then I will start in the next lecture with showing you the so-called easy species, species that you can recognize already in the field and that you may learn before you get deeper into the secrets of the genus Entoloma. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we will see each other again in the next lecture.